BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. BlackBoxNed88 on Instagram for the bonus podcast. And welcome to BBOR, the home of true crime talk radio and your premier destination for unsolved mysteries, criminal psychology, and exploring the dark side of cyberspace. My name is Ned DeHaan, and I am your host, as well as the creator of Astro Psych 400 here on YouTube, and regular contributor to the Zodiac Killer channel. And a great way to support these shows is just by listening to some more content. But you can also go over to Amazon.com and have a look at the book Killer on a White Horse, written by me, Ned DeHaan. It is a novel, murder mystery, inspired by the Zodiac Manson connection, but it is indeed fictional. However, who doesn't love a good mystery? And there is always the TeeSpring page. Feel free to check out some of the merchandise. And remember, being weird is not a crime. Let the show begin. Okay, hello everybody. Today is Monday, another Zodiac Monday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? I hope everyone had a good weekend. Just a couple of quick announcements and reminders before we truly begin. The first is that there has been a return of the Black Box Online Radio Shorts page here on YouTube, and the shorts are also going to be released on Instagram, BlackBoxNed88, and also on Facebook. My personal Facebook is in the description box, so please look out for some extra content that is available on this channel. And the second is that this is going to be a two-part episode, and like earlier this spring, I did the Zodiac Killer News Report for Zodiac Monday, and the second half came out for the Anything Goes Friday segment. So to those of you who are following these episodes live, please look out for that on Friday, and if you're listening to this in the playlist, you can just keep on listening right through the episodes. Now, there's another piece of news that I want to share with you guys, and you may have noticed that there's an individual named Raymond Penrod who has been spamming the episodes here on Black Box Online Radio, posting frequently, talking about his Zodiac Killer suspect, Richard Ralph Mangan, and I asked him once, what's the whole point of this? And he said that he wouldn't stop until the media takes notice. And in a previous episode, I said that I have openly given Ray Penrod an invitation to talk to me, to do an interview, to do something, to write out a statement, to just share some ideas, just to share his story about his Zodiac Killer suspect, Richard Ralph Mangan. And all I've heard are the crickets. Crickets. Absolutely nothing. I have not heard anything back, and I was just right here waiting for it. I mean, I know that Black Box Online Radio perhaps isn't the media connection that he wanted, but it's definitely a start, or at the very least you would be able to share your story with other people who are following the Zodiac Killer news and the Zodiac Killer case, the entire mystery, as opposed to some of the mainstream publications. I haven't heard anything back, yet Ray continues to spam the episodes here on Black Box Online Radio. The invitation stands. I try to give everybody their day in court, and the only exceptions are if I think that the person is fraudulent, or if I think that their claim is too absurd for discussion, and that very rarely happens. I mean, because then it requires a little bit of people reading abilities, which I don't get too into. I mean, how do you know that someone is genuinely lying before you've heard them evaluate their findings? So I talk about all types of suspects here on the Zodiac Killer News Report. And in this episode, I want to look at a particular suspect, that I've never mentioned before, but I have been meaning to look into. And his name is Giuseppe Bevalaqua. And this is going to be an episode where I'm going to be dealing with lots of Italian names, and I'm going to apologize in advance as I butcher all of the pronunciations. Not everybody can be like Christoph Waltz and Inglourious Bastards and just magically step into a perfect Italian accent, or at the very least, strong pronunciation. But this is a story that is going to be connected to a different set of homicides that took place in the nation of Italy. And the Monster of Florence was a serial killer that began operating in 1974 and went on to around 1975. Now, many of you will know that the Zodiac Killer was a serial killer who operated in California in 1968 and 69. But then the Zodiac Killer continued to write letters and communications and send them in to the not only the media, but also taunting the various people. I mean, they're all types of Zodiac killer communications. I mean, even when we have things like the Halloween card, which was sent to Paul Avery, that's both. It's taunting somebody, but it's also sent to someone from the San Francisco Chronicle. The Zodiac killer would also mail in ciphers and cryptograms, the 408, the 340, the 13, and the 32, and possibly other cryptograms such as the Fairfield ciphers. So the Zodiac's true identity and true persona exists in the communications rather than the murders that have actually been attributed to him. But it's highly recognized that the final Zodiac killer the final Zodiac killer letter, was mailed in 1974, and it was the Exorcist letter, although some people believe that the communications went well beyond that. One of them would be Richard Grinnell of ZodiacCiphers.com, saying he believes the Zodiac letters went all the way up to 1987, and then possibly even the 2001 card, but he has a very strong belief that the 1987 letter is authentic. Now, to help us out, I'm going to go over to an article that was written on the website Ostello Volante. As I said, butchering pronunciations. There is not an ounce of Italian in me anywhere, genetically, regionally, and definitely not linguistically. But yes, this is by Francesco Amaconi, Joe Bevalaqua official biographical records. Now, this is the main documentation of Giuseppe Bevalaqua, who was also known as Joe. He was born in Tautoa, New Jersey on December 20th of 1935 into an Italian-American family. In 1954, Bevalaqua was drafted into the Army and transferred to Germany. A few years later, he became a CBR chemical instructor, a specialty he performed until 1964, when he joined the 5th Criminal Investigation Detachment of the military in Leghorn, Italy. During the time of the Zodiac murders and letters, Bevalaqua worked as an undercover detective with the Army CID. This information comes from Bevalaqua himself and other subjects that are not mentioned according to the ethic rules of journalism on source protection. Okay, firstly, two major points. I think that this is going to be a story where the timeline might actually match up somewhat reasonably. Secondarily, okay, you're saying you have a source, but you can't reveal who your source is. We encounter this all the time in the true crime world, all the time when looking at true crime cases, and it very simply comes down to the fact that we don't know where this information is coming from. And I'm going to get to the heart of the issue. I've read several other posts about Joseph Bevalaqua, and it appears that he confessed to somebody allegedly that he was the Zodiac killer. It appears that he made other types of confessions, as you just heard there, that he was some type of undercover Army military patrol officer. But how do we, the people, verify these claims? In 1968, Bevalaqua was assigned to Vietnam. Decorations obtained were Silver Star, Bronze Star, Soldier's Medal, and Purple Heart. Bevalaqua ID military card said that he was 5 feet 8 inches tall, the same height as the Zodiac according to 4 witnesses. Aha, but that is not all of the witnesses. For example, at Lake Berryessa, Cecilia Shepard reported that the Zodiac killer was 6 feet tall, and Officer Falk, who saw the Zodiac after the murder of Paul Stein, roughly 2 weeks after Lake Berryessa, estimated that his height was 5 feet 10. So some witnesses did indeed say that the Zodiac was 5 foot 8, but also not all of them are in agreement that the Zodiac was that height. Now, Joseph Bevalaqua was also 200 pounds, and he had a stocky body with a prominent stomach and 2 characteristics that accompanied him into old age. Bevalaqua had thick, dark hair that he wore in a crew cut, which was dyed starting in the 1980s. His appearance matched the witness testimonies of the Zodiac, with the partial exception of the hair, which is described different after the known sightings. And yes, this is true. I mean, after the Blue Rock Springs shooting on July 4th of 1969, Mike Michaud said that the Zodiac killer may have possibly had reddish-brown curls in his hair, and of course you can see the composite sketch that was drawn after the Paul Stein murder, which shows someone who seems to have light-colored hair, although we can't really tell. I mean, you're looking at a black-and-white image, but it appears to be light-colored hair. In the end of 1974, Bevalaqua retired from the Army with the rank of first sergeant and settled in Florence, Italy, working for the AMBC, that's the American Cemetery and Memorial of Florence. And he was the superintendent trainee of the cemetery in 1974, going on to become a more permanent employee there. Bevalaqua stayed in Florence and the serial killer, nicknamed the Monster of Florence, killed 14 people in the countryside surrounding the Tuscan city. Most of the crimes took place less than an hour's drive from the American cemetery. 3 years after the monster's last known crime in 1989, the AMBC transferred Bevalaqua to Nettuno, Nettuno, or something like that, near Rome. He was then called to testify in the Pacciani trial on the double murder of the monster, which had taken place about 300 yards as the crow flies from his home. In 1985, Bevalaqua said to the court that he saw the defendant and victims a few days before their death, and he made a serious mistake, claiming to have learned of the murders the day after the crime, when the news had not yet disclosed the information. He retired in 2010 and was married with 3 adult daughters. Bevalaqua lived in the suburb of Florence. In 2007, after a few meetings for a project on his biography, he admitted responsibility to someone in both the Zodiac cases and the Monster of Florence cases. In 2018, this is the writer of the post, mind you, I made a complaint to the police and published the first article on Bevalaqua's involvement in serial crimes. And this guy appears to be a career military individual. By career, I mean he did 20 years in the military. He also seems like somebody who had a background in sciences. As you heard from the beginning, he was a CBR chemical instructor. And a lot of people believe that the Zodiac was ex-military. And they also believe that the Zodiac killer had a background in either the math or science fields. And a prime example of this is when the Zodiac wrote in one letter saying that I'm mildly serious to know how much money you have on my head, or something to that effect. I'm paraphrasing. But the word curious is misspelled Cerous, which is similar to the chemical compound cerous oxalate. That would be just one of the examples that comes to mind. Not to mention that the Zodiac is talking about radians and inches along the radians, saying that there's this location of the bomb and it concerns radians and inches along the radians, and those might be something that somebody who has a background in the math and sciences would talk about. And not to mention the physical features, 5 feet 8, 200 pounds with a big stomach. All of this stuff is in the witness reports in various places. For example, at Lake Berryessa, they even talked about how the Zodiac appeared taller than 5 foot 8, but he had a pouched stomach. And this, it really is not as bad of a suspect profile as I thought. I mean, not gonna lie to you guys. When I heard about this suspect, Joseph Bevalaqua, Giuseppe Bevalaqua, and he used both names in his life, I was horribly skeptical. I was like, this is just going to be a load of crap, a load of baloney, and this is just somebody trying to connect 2 different true crime stories together using a lousy suspect. And I'm still holding on to the skeptical card. I'm still holding on to that, and I'm very pessimistic about where this story is going to end up, but I do have to give a certain amount of credit to that post from the website whose name I don't want to butcher again, which I've read to you. It does have a few major points that seem to match up. The timeline, for example, the Monster of Florence also was more or less a serial killer that targeted lovers' lanes, and the leaving in 1974, and then the Monster of Florence crime started in 1974, being in America in 1968 and 69. And there's even an additional line that says that for the Giuseppe Bevalaqua was relocated to a different military camp for 1972 and 73, which matches up again to the Zodiac killer's Halton activities, because the Zodiac killer committed the final crime on October 11th of 1969, and as previously stated, the Zodiac would go on to write letters all the way into 1971. Then, from 1972 to 1973, there is the halt on Zodiac activity, and what a lot of people believe is that the Zodiac killer simply just moved on to a different location, that he was stationed outside of the Bay Area for some reason. And when I use stationed, I mean, a lot of people think that it was with the military, but it could have been done for other reasons. He could have gone to jail for a different crime. He could have had some type of issue in his life which prevented him from being the Zodiac or doing anything Zodiac related. But I first learned about Giuseppe Bevalaqua from Mike Rodelli, who is the author of In the Shadow of Mount Diablo and The Hunt for Zodiac. And he talked to me about this a couple years ago, and I've interviewed Mike Rodelli a couple times, once off the air and once on the air for the Zodiac Killer channel's Interview with the Expert series, and I invite you to like and subscribe to the Zodiac Killer channel, also visiting the podcast Serial Killer Z to A, which is available anywhere you get your podcasts, including Spotify and iHeartRadio. But Mike Rodelli said, "Oh yeah, there's this new guy out there who's writing a book about how the Zodiac Killer is connected to the Monster of Florence story in Italy," and I had never heard of the Monster of Florence. And I'm going to tell you the truth, actually. Mike Rodelli didn't say that word for word. What he said was there was a woman who is writing the book, and I think the guy's name, well, sorry, the guy's name is Francesco. I think Mike Rodelli thought her name was Francesca, and Francesca. It's an easy mistake. And Mike Rodelli has actually authored a post about the Zodiac Killer Monster of Florence connection for his website, MikeRodelli.com, and it's called Zodiac versus the Monster of Florence, and I would like to read that for you now. One of the more persistent and annoying theories on the case is that the Zodiac Killer was a man named Joseph Bevalaqua, who served in the U.S. military and been stationed in the Presidio during the Zodiac era, who moved just outside of Florence, Italy, a couple of months before the first monster attack. And it's claimed that he was both the Zodiac Killer and the Monster of Florence. I do not agree in any way with this line of reasoning, although there are some admittedly MO similarities between the two killers. However, when you look at the signature aspects of these two killers, the case for the Zodiac also being the Monster of Florence falls apart. As far as MO is concerned, the proponent of this theory correctly points out that the Monster and the Zodiac were Lover's Lane killers. As I said, I'll give him that point. However, as you get deeper into the case of the Monster of Florence, the issue is with the 1968 murders in the town of Lastra Asina, which lies northwest of the city of Florence, and their relationship to the monster murders. The crime was the murders of Barbara Loci and Antonio Lobianco, and they were committed in a known lover's lane. After much analysis, which is too detailed to get into here, it is widely believed that the same gun was used in the Loci-Lobianco murders as all of the later monster crimes. The Loci-Lobianco murders were not committed by the Monster of Florence himself, although the Loci-Lobianco murders would be linked to his crimes in 1982. It is widely believed that the monster was ritualistically reproducing the Loci-Lobianco murders when he attacked lovers' lanes and also killed amorous couples beginning in September of 1974. The point being that the MO of attacking in lovers' lane areas may not even be original to the monster, but may have been copied from previous unrelated crime scenes. Therefore, it seems that the monster, unlike the Zodiac, was potentially not even killing people in lovers' lane areas by his own design. Therefore, this aspect of the monster crimes does not match what the Zodiac did as neatly as one might have you believe. Zodiac's most obvious signature behavior was the fact that he loved to write boastful, taunting letters to the press, mainly the San Francisco Chronicle. These letters often include cryptograms and bomb diagrams. The Zodiac also gave himself the nickname, while the monster definitely wrote letters, and most notably sent one to the prosecutor Silvia Della Monica after his last crime in 1985. None of them were the same nature as the Zodiac letters, and none of them contained cryptograms or bomb diagrams. Excellent point, Mike Rodelli. I mean it, excellent point. And the name The Monster of Florence was created by reporter Mario Spezzi, and the monster likely wrote letters in 1982, but he sent them directly to the police, and the goal of these letters was to create misdirection in the investigation, not to boast. To wit, the monster likely created what is known as the Sardinian Trail, whereby he led the police down a blind alley while investigating the Sardinian clan, who actually murdered Loci and Lobianco in 1968 in a vain effort to find the Monster of Florence. In short, the Zodiac needed to boast to the entire Bay Area. The monster did not have such a need in the surrounding areas of Florence. There were no "this is the monster" speaking letters. Therefore, while both killers wrote letters, the content and the goal of the letters was not the same. All right, I follow Mike Rodelli a little bit more clearly than the original profile for the suspect. Finally, let's talk about the most important difference between the Zodiac Killer and the Monster of Florence. According to a profiler named Richard Walter, the Zodiac was a sexual power assertive killer. Zodiac killed for a sense of power, not to fulfill any sexual or anger needs. I'm not 100% convinced on that because I tend to agree more with somebody like Dr. Todd Grante, who created his own psychological profile of the Zodiac Killer, and he said that the Zodiac was rather similar to the Son of Sam shootings with David Berkowitz, that The crimes were sexually motivated, but there was not physical sexual contact made with the victims. And I tend to think that even though we're not talking about like some guy like Andre Chikatilo who's ejaculating while he's committing the crimes, although I think the Zodiac may have done some of that later on. And the Zodiac would go on to say in the 408 cipher that to kill is the most thrilling experience. It's even better than getting your rocks off with a girl. I think that the Zodiac did have some type of sexual motivation. It was creating some type of arousal or excitement without physical contact. Now, maybe that's not exactly what Mike Rodelli was referring to, but that's what I think happened. So, as I said, I side with Dr. Todd Grande. Now, to talk about the Zodiac Monster of Florence connection, you've heard about how there is this suspect out there named Giuseppe Bevalaqua, who was known as Joe in America as his nickname. But let's just go through the basic profile of the Monster of Florence. We've talked a lot about Bevalaqua. Let's see what happens with the Monster of Florence and the most basic profile that's been created. The Monster of Florence was the English name of the Italian serial killer Il Mostro di Firenze. Sorry, and is a name commonly used by the Italian media for an unidentified serial killer who was active within the province of Florence between 1974 and 1985, perhaps also in 1986, and that refers to the Lo Bianco murders that were that Mike Rodelli was discussing. So it's possible that the Monster of Florence committed a crime in 1986. The monster murdered 14 victims, usually young couples in secluded areas in wooded areas as well during the new moons. Well, that also doesn't seem to be something completely consistent with the Zodiac. The Zodiac's dates and activities really don't have any strong pattern, in my personal opinion. Law enforcement conducted several investigations into the cases over several years. In 2000, the courts convicted 2 individuals for 4 of the double homicides. They had been charged with being part of an alleged group of murderers that were known as the Snacks Companions, or Compagni di Merende. Multiple weapons were used in the murders, including a .22 caliber Beretta handgun and a knife, and in half of the cases, sex organs were excised from the bodies of the female victims. Okay, .22 caliber handgun, that is absolutely what the Zodiac killer might have used. Removing sex organs from the victims or doing anything to the sex organs of the victims? No, absolutely not. But as previously stated, there were 14 murders that were attributed to the Monster of Florence, and only 4 of the double homicides were attributed to these other convicted killers. I mean, I'm going to do the math and say that that's 8 murders that were committed by them. The other 6 are unsolved. And the victims were Antonio Lobianco, Barbaloci, Pasquale Gentilcore, Stefani Patini, Carmela De Nuccio, Giovanni Foggio, Stefano Baldi, Susanna Cambi, Antonella Millerini, Paolo Maradini, Wilhelm Friedrich Horstmeyer, and Jens Uwe Rusch, Claudio Stefanacci, Pia Rontini, Jean-Michel Cravalici, and Nadine Mario. Now, the first crime took place on August 21st of 1968, and it was the murders of Antonio Lobianco and Barbaloci, as previously stated. They were shot with a .22 caliber handgun in a town to the west of Florence. The couple were attacked in a car while Loci's son lay asleep in the back seat, and waking up to find his mother dead, the child fled and reached a house 2 kilometers away. Absolutely, that doesn't sound like anything Zodiac related, but that is not a confirmed crime. In 1982, the murders of Lobianco and Loci were linked to the more recent murders based on a tip from an anonymous writer who had a possibly signed Un cittadino amico, a friendly citizen letter. Okay, well, I mean, that definitely sounds like the Zodiac killer. I'm just making a list of points for and against the Zodiac and the whole a concerned citizen thing going on, signed a citizen. And they found 5 bullets and 5 small shell casings stored in a folder among the Melli's case file, and authorities were able to construct a chain of custody of those pieces of evidence and did not request a scientific comparison, even though it would have been necessary to check whether they matched the ballistic report from 1968. As the spent cartridges were fired by a gun used in 4 similar crimes, their presence in the Melli case file suggested to law enforcement officers that the perpetrator of the more recent double homicides was connected to them. I'm just gonna break that down for you. I think the long story short is that's an unconfirmed set of homicides. It's an unconfirmed double homicide. It's an unconfirmed crime where the Zodiac, the monster of Florence, may have committed some type of early crime in 1968. But does that mean that it was Giuseppe Bevalaqua? That doesn't even mean that it was the monster of Florence. And as previously stated, it appears that there have been convictions for some of these crimes. On September 15th of 1974, teenage sweethearts Pasquale Gentilecore and Stefania Pettini, an accountant, were shot to death and stabbed in a country lane near Borgo San Lorenzo after having sex in the Fiat 127 car. They were not far from the notorious discotheque called Teen Club, where they were supposed to spend the evening with friends. And one of the victims was stabbed 97 times. Phew, I mean, the closest thing we would get to that in the Zodiac Killer world is the Snoozy and Furlong murders in 1969, but I mean, I just don't think that that's Zodiac related at all. Okay, so big strike against any type of Zodiac Monster of Florence connection. The Zodiac stabbed two of his victims, Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard, but in a calm and composed and calculated manner. I mean, his hands are shaking a little bit, and he's talking to Brian Hartnell, and Brian Hartnell says, you seem nervous. Are you nervous? And he says, yeah. And then Brian Hartnell says, yeah, I would be too. And he stabbed Brian Hartnell 6 times in the back and Cecilia Shepard 10 times. Absolutely nothing like this stabbing the victims 97 times. In the Foggio and Danuccio murders, on June 6 of 1981, warehouseman Giovanni Foggio and shop assistant Carmela Danuccio were shot and stabbed near Scandinici, and they were engaged, and both the couples lived together. Danuccio's body was pulled out of the car and the killer cut out her pubic area with a notched knife. Absolutely not like the Zodiac Killer. On October 23rd of 1981, workman Stefano Baldi and telephonist Susanna Cambi, who were engaged, were shot and stabbed in the park in the vicinity of Calenzano. Cambi's pubic area, I always read that word as public, I don't know why. Cambi's pubic area was cut out like Danuccio's. Not Zodiac related at all. And there is this story that Cecilia Shepard was sexually assaulted with the knife at Lake Berryessa, and that was a myth that was shared numerous times. And Gareth Penn went on to write a book called Time 17 in 1987, and he wrote a follow-up book called The Second Power, and I have book discussions on both of these. And in The Second Power, he openly apologized to the public for being a believer of this myth in the past that Cecilia Shepard was sexually assaulted with the knife. And I think that it comes from the belief that, or just, there's a line in the police reports where it talks about at the Lake Berryessa stabbing on September 27th of 1969, that the Zodiac Killer stabbed Cecilia Shepard in the vagina because there was pooling of blood in her groinal area. I repeat, the part that's in the police report is that there was the pooling of blood in her groinal area. But no, Cecilia Shepard was not sexually assaulted with a knife, and both of these women have their pubic regions cut out. This seems like a completely different type of serial killer, and some people just simply want to point out that, well, the Zodiac could have been somebody almost creating the Zodiac persona as a type of training ground, or kind of someone who's coming into their own form, and maybe he went on to become a more vicious serial killer, an intensified serial killer, or a more calculating serial killer, a more expansive serial killer. But as of now, I have to just look at the facts and say we're dealing with a completely different type of person. Now, there are a couple other crimes here, such as the Mainardi and Millerini murders. And on June 19th of 1982, mechanic Paolo Mainardi was 22 years old, and dressmaker Antonella Millerini were shot to death just after having sex in Mainardi's car on a provincial road in Monte Spertoli. This time, the killer did not have the time to mutilate the female victim. So right now I'm going to give the temporary conclusion that I think there are some strong points for Giuseppe Bevalaqua to have been the Zodiac Killer. Physical appearance, descriptions, and also his timeline, all of those seem to match up with the condition that the 1968 murders that were previously discussed were not that of the monster of Florence, and that might have been an unrelated homicide or an unrelated double homicide. But I think that the evidence pile is not that big in the general context in terms of someone going on from being the Zodiac killer to commit these types of genital mutilation murders. I don't think that that is Zodiac related. The cons have a much bigger tally chart for Giuseppe Bevalaqua as a Zodiac killer suspect, but that is my own genuine first take on the subject, and I would love to know what you guys think. What do you think about him as a Zodiac killer suspect? What do you think about the story of the Monster of Florence? Do you see any type of similarity that is involved with these types of killers? And, I mean, I also have to give one note that you might have noticed in the Monster of Florence timeline, without any Zodiac connection, there appear to be very large gaps. I mean, we have one crime committed in 1974, and then the next crime in the 1980s. So that goes to show that maybe it is possible that the Monster of Florence committed a homicide in 1968 and then didn't act again for 6 years until 1974. Maybe that is possible, but that doesn't have anything to do with the Zodiac killer. That is about a different unsolved set of Italian mysteries. But again, I'd like to read your comments down below. And there's a second reason why I wanted to talk about the Monster of Florence, and that is because when people were discussing the Zodiac killer suspect, McDuff, I heard Mike Morford appear on somebody's podcast. Mike Morford is the guy who brought McDuff forward as a suspect. His full name is William McDuff Andrew. And what he said was that, I mean, someone just asked the question, is your suspect of either British or Northern European heritage? And he said yes. And when I began to think about it, the majority of Zodiac killer suspects have heritage from the British Isles, including Ireland. I mean, Ireland's an independent country, but from the British Isles or from Northern Europe. I mean, when we look at suspects such as Arthur Lee Allen, he even had Norwegian ancestry. A lot of them have British ancestry, like Louis Myers was very passionate about his Scottish heritage. And I noticed that there weren't too many suspects of Southern European descent, and Giuseppe Bevalaqua would be a good example of someone who was an Italian American and was of Southern European heritage, and it seems like he had a very strong connection to Italy, living there multiple times, going on to settle there permanently. But as far as this type of Norwegian connection, I mean, Arthur Lee Allen had some Norwegian heritage, but so did another Zodiac killer suspect named Shel Cavalli, who is the suspect of the previously mentioned Mike Rodelli. And there are several clues in the Zodiac killer mystery that show something Norwegian. For starters, the SLA letter, if that is indeed from the Zodiac killer, which was mailed in 1974, says SLA, an Old Norse word meaning kill, and it's actually written almost like SLA slay, an Old Norse word meaning kill. And there's something that I had wanted to do for a while, and that was to go through some YouTube videos about the Sun Cross. Because earlier this year, I did a segment on BlackBoxOnlineRadio talking about the Celtic Cross, and I was looking at how the Celtic Cross could have been an inspiration for the Zodiac killer to choose as symbol. And there are two reasons for this. One is that, I mean, as previously mentioned with Louis Myers, Randy Kenny, who brought him forward as a suspect, said that Louis Myers chose the Celtic Cross because he was passionate about his Scottish heritage, and it is a zodiac sign, but that was the reason why he chose that particular symbol. And then we have other people like Sam Fisher, who talked about his zodiac suspect, Joseph Paul Franklin, who was a white supremacist, and the Celtic Cross was more or less hijacked by white supremacists after World War II, and has been used in some of their iconography, if I'm using the word correctly. And there's a very similar symbol out there called the Sun Cross. And I went through some videos on that, and the differences are that the Sun Cross has Norse connections. It's a tradition from the Scandinavian countries, the Nordic world even. And one thing, though, that I found that was quite different, though, in these historical examinations is that the Celtic Cross has a very clear history, and I even talked about it in one of the YouTube shorts, which I invite you to watch, especially on Instagram or Facebook, but also it has this type of unknown history, and we don't know the exact origins of the Sun Cross and the exact meanings that were used by it. Firstly, it's a very simple, basic symbol, but when I was going through
people who are just, when I was going through the histories of when people are discussing this, they're all saying the same thing. The origin of this symbol is unknown. There are some possibilities as to how the sun cross was created, and it could represent, firstly, the sun, and the reason why it has the four segments could be very simply for the solstices and the equinoxes, but we aren't even sure if the people who originally used the sun cross were paying attention to the solstices and the equinox. We have two solstices, right? The winter solstice and the summer solstice, and we have the spring equinox and the fall equinox, and it can also represent a wheel. And I was watching this one YouTube video where the Norwegian presenter was saying, now why would somebody make a wheel and put that with the sun? Well, very simply, the sun is moving across the sky, and the way like a wheel would turn, and it's very normal in mythology for the sun to be represented by the wheel of a chariot. I mean, even like you might even find some similar things in Greek and Roman mythology that because the sun moves across the sky, there's some type of association with wheels and turning, and I think that those are all very, very reasonable observations. But what I think is more fascinating is that, let's not kid ourselves, there are certain illustrations of the sun cross that are identical to the Celtic cross. I mean, you can find the exact same set of symbols that are used, or they're drawn in the exact same way. The majority of illustrations of the sun cross have a symbol where the long lines do not extend beyond the edge of the circle. You have a circle, and then you have the lines that go up and down, and they're usually held within the circle, but not in all of the illustrations. In some of them, very clearly, the sun cross extends beyond the edge of the circle. And there are also even sun crosses that look virtually identical to the Celtic cross used by white supremacists. So I'm not completely sure if the Zodiac Killer had the biggest inspiration drawn from the sun cross specifically. And the more I think about it, the more I begin to think that if there's any type of astronomical or astrological connection to symbols, it would just simply represent the actual zodiac, like the 12 months of the year. And even on AstroPsych 400, I had an astrological symbol that has a circle with a cross going through it. That was the other YouTube channel that I was running. And you can see that there is a little bit more detail that has been added. It's more intricate, but there's still a circle with a cross going through it. And Michael Cole talks about this in the Zodiac Revisited trilogy when he says that everybody singing the Zodiac was into astrology. Maybe it's actually astronomy. This goes right back to all the things we've been talking about. Someone who's ex-military, who has maybe had some familiarity with math and the sciences, someone who would be involved with that. And there are countless Zodiac killer suspects out there who fit the bill. Firstly, anybody who's in the Navy or the Air Force, or the book out there, Zodiac Cracked, that is talking about the Zodiac suspect Warren Orlestis, who was an astronomer and made telescopes. I mean, so many Zodiac killer suspects can be placed under that set of parameters. So that doesn't really narrow it down, but I do think that those are strong observations. And we also have to remember that the Zodiac Killer symbol could have just been borrowed from the watch. And yes, I would cite Drew Beeson, author of Citing It on the Zodiac Killer, because he has been perhaps the loudest voice about this when people are all like, was it a Celtic cross? Was it a sun cross? Was it an astrological symbol? No, it's from the Zodiac brand of watches. You even see the word Zodiac next to the symbol, and that's most likely the inspiration for how it was chosen. But you can find countless symbols that are similar, whether it's a church in Pocahontas, Iowa, or something like that that has a circle with a cross going through it, or you can have certain tail lights on Don Harden's car that have rounded shapes with a circle with a cross going through it. I mean, I just thought that it was just a little bit interesting to hear some of these statements about the different symbols, the sun cross and the Celtic cross. And I did the short episode on the Celtic cross earlier this year, and I had been planning on doing several more episodes on just symbols and symbology. And I know that those things aren't super popular for Black Box Online Radio. It's more or less just something of personal fascination, if you will. And I mean, I don't see why the short page would be off limits to those types of topics. Maybe not enough for a 40-minute episode here on BBOR, but in the short section, why not? Right now, I would like to get to your shout-outs from BuyMeACoffee.com. BuyMeACoffee.com/BlackBoxNed88 allows you to make a donation or a contribution to help support the show, and anybody who makes a donation will get a shout-out on Zodiac Monday. And of course, there is also the BBOR Premium membership, which gives you access to bonus features and bonus content, including the guide True Crime Teaches Us to Conquer Toxic People, written by me, Ned DeHaan, and that is just one of many. I've also done members-only podcasts for YouTube users, where people can just get a little bit of a behind-the-scenes look at Black Box Online Radio. There are a lot of things available at buymeacoffee.com/blackboxned88, and there's a link to that in the description box. And our first shout-out comes to us from Batman66. Batman66, thank you so much for your regular and consistent support, and I appreciate all the ideas that Batman66 has brought to the channel, and Bruce Wayne, you are amazing. Our next shout-out comes to us from Andreas Molteno, who says, "Thank you so much for the content, Ned. It really takes my mind off things. Really appreciate it, and keep up the good work." And that's just music to my ears, Andreas. I mean, that's one of the things that I really want to do with this channel, because have you guys noticed that there's some YouTube channels out there that really enjoy the negative feedback, and some people are genuinely trolling, and they're genuinely playing a character that's meant to agitate the audience or to get certain people riled up. And then there are also YouTube channels where the majority of the people who follow the channel don't like the presenter, they don't like the content, and they just trash talk the entire time in the live streams or in the comment section. The majority of comments are negative, and they are just very harsh and critical. And you just have to wonder, though, like, well, why are people even listening to a show that they don't like, listening to a user-generated YouTube channel that they don't like? And that is absolutely not my intention. Can I just be very honest with you guys for a second? I do not want to create a channel that's based on negative feedback just to get clicks and ratings, and I mean, getting a bigger audience of people that don't like the channel. Some people might do that out there, and I suppose under the terms of free speech and free expression, they might have the right to do that, but that is definitely not going to be my style. I wanted to create a place where people can talk about true crime cases, and that's the primary focus, talking about true crime cases, unsolved mysteries, and even some other subjects, like I said, symbology. Why not? Because any subject is fair game, really, especially for the shorts and the Anything Goes Friday segment. And that's just it. It's about being curious about life and being curious about certain areas that other people are afraid to explore. Now, on that note, I want to look at something that is very general in relation to serial killers and mass shooters. In the past, I've done a comparison between James Holmes, the Aurora, Colorado shooter, and the Zodiac killer. And yes, James Holmes was a mass shooter, and the Zodiac killer was a serial killer. But I wanted to look at something that had been posted on Amazon.com because I read a lot of true crime books. This one was recommended to me, and it's called A Dark Night in Aurora. It just came up as a suggestion from Amazon.com. A Dark Night in Aurora, Inside James Holmes and the Colorado Mass Shootings. And the reason why I'm going to read the book description for you is because it ends with a particular challenge question. And you guys know that I like challenge questions. On July 20th, 2012, in Aurora, Colorado, a man in a dark body armor and gas mask suit entered a midnight premiere of The Dark Knight Rises with a tactical shotgun, a high-capacity assault rifle, and a sidearm. He threw a canister of tear gas into the crowd and began firing. Soon, 12 people were dead and 58 were injured. Young children and pregnant women were among them. The man was found calmly waiting at his car, and he was detained without resistance. Unlike Columbine, Newtown, San Bernardino, Orlando, Las Vegas, and Jacksonville, James Holmes is unique among mass shooters in his willingness to be taken into custody alive. The massacre was a precursor to those in New Zealand and Parkland. In the court case that followed, only Dr. William H. Reed, was a distinguished forensic psychiatrist, would be allowed to record interviews with the defendant. Reed would read Holmes's diary, investigate his phone calls and text messages, and interview his family and acquaintances and speak to his victims, and review tens of thousands of pages of evidence and court testimony in an attempt to understand how a happy, seemingly normal child could become a killer. And that is the challenge question that I want to explore. How could the happy, normal kid go on to become a killer? And one more time, the book is called A Dark Night in Aurora. And firstly, I'm going to answer the challenge question because it's related to the Zodiac killer, all serial killers, all mass shooters, all murderers. I think that firstly, James Holmes was very good at putting on the facade of being happy. People are talking about, hey, there's no way this guy acted alone. They're showing videos of him giving presentations at his university in the weeks prior to the shooting, and he's just has this smile on his face, and he's talking and laughing with the audience. And they're like, how could this guy go on to become a shooter? Not everyone shows all aspects of their personality publicly. And also, I mean, I've never experienced any of this stuff firsthand. I've never killed anyone, but I expect that these people wouldn't have the type of murderous rage continuously. I expect they would be experiencing a variety of emotions, and even if they have a plan to behave in a certain way, like they have a plan to commit a homicide, maybe they have moments where they are able to experience certain periods of happiness or laughter or elation or some type of euphoria from a completely unrelated reason. Because I think that the media creates this perception and image of serial killers and mass shooters that they're just only focused on murderous rage, and that's what's behind their facade, and just that's their true identity. When in reality, I think it's something quite to the contrary. I think that they are people who experience different emotions, and they're just simply acting on urges, and they're rather blank when it comes to the conscience, but not blank when it comes to experiencing these emotions. And I was even watching the Violent Minds documentary series on Peacock, which I've talked to you guys about a little bit before, and giving a shout out to Melissa Rose Tappa and Thornton Daniel Jeffrey for recommending that one to me. And Dr. Al Carlisle was interviewing Ted Bundy, and he said that he just seemed so childish when he was talking to him. It's like he was talking like a son who almost hit a home run in a baseball game. I mean, the son talking to his father, that is. And instantly I thought of a documentary that I watched about Jeffrey Dahmer about 4 years ago, when the priest who baptized Jeffrey Dahmer in prison was talking about him and just saying, you spend 5 minutes with him, he starts talking like a little kid. And I think that a lot of these serial killers and mass shooters have different aspects of their personality that the media truly ignores, and they aren't always filled with murderous rage. But how does somebody go on to become a killer? I think with James Holmes, it's very obvious. He wasn't getting the sex that he wanted. He wasn't getting the approval from women that he wanted. He wasn't getting the validation that he wanted. And that drew him to deal with certain feelings of rejection from society. And ultimately, he wanted to get revenge on society because he thought he would not only never find love, but also never find a certain type of appreciation from the people he desired, and I think that that is the biggest nutshell version of it. So, I mean, this is some stuff that I think we could look at in some other cases. I've done standalone episodes on the Newtown shooting in Connecticut, as well as on Columbine, and I have a psychological profile episode on the Columbine shooters, Eric Harrison, Dylan Klebold, and I also have a standalone episode about the Sandy Hook shooting. It's called Sandy Hook Shooting 10 Years Later, and that was again responding to some pieces of information in the media. So I invite you to listen, as well as hit the like button and subscribe if you're curious about these true crime cases for the Anything Goes Friday segment. Anything is fair game, so I will be talking about that in the future, even though I'm going to be concentrating on some shorts. And I would like to conclude this episode with a challenge question that was sent to us from Michael Fisher, and he sent this into the email address, BlackBoxOnlineRadio@AOL.com. Anybody can write the show there, and it says, "Hi Ned, I was listening to the recent Zodiac Monday, and it made me think, why is the Zodiac referred to as a serial killer instead of a terrorist? His behavior and methods seem more akin to the Unabomber or Timothy McVeigh. In the 1960s, I can see why the Zodiac might be lumped into the serial killer category, but it strikes me as a possibly outdated term. I don't think the Unabomber was the Zodiac, but I can see the logic in this connection, more than putting the Zodiac on a list alongside BTK, Ted Bundy, and so on. And I wonder if thinking if the Zodiac was a serial killer has actually hindered finding him all of these years, because one is looking for him in places where he is not, and using reference material that doesn't apply. A problem I have with profiling the Zodiac as a serial killer is that he's so generic and unoriginal. He has no signature. He's very much a copycat killer himself. This is part of the reason I also think he's so hard to find. Everything he does resembles 100 other killers. If you think of him as just a serial killer, I just thought it would be interesting to see the results of a listener challenge question. Zodiac killer, serial killer, or domestic terrorist? Okay, I mean, firstly, this is a brilliant question from Michael Fisher, and he is absolutely right. Some people do think that the Zodiac Killer was the Unabomber. Some people do think that the Zodiac Killer was BTK, Dennis Rader, and the Unabomber connection is much stronger because BTK was almost certainly out of the country for the entirety of Zodiac activity, stationed in Japan, firstly on Kadena Air Base and then Tachikawa Air Base, 1968, 69, and 70, so he's pretty much out of the country. His family has openly dismissed any type of Zodiac Killer BTK connection. But I want to look at some things from a different point of view. I think that at a certain point we have to accept that both of them could apply. And as a case in point, I would like to look at the Unabomber. People frequently refer to the Unabomber as both a domestic terrorist and a serial killer, and I think that that's an appropriate discussion because the Zodiac is indeed both a serial killer and a domestic terrorist. He committed multiple murders with a cooling off period, returned to normalcy, particularly between the Lake Herman Road murders of 1968 and the July 4th, 1969 Blue Rock Springs murder. And then he's also making threats to detonate a bomb, to get school children as they come bouncing off the bus. He is making numerous threats to go on a kill rampage, all types of threats. Very clearly, the Zodiac Killer is a domestic terrorist. As far as I'm linking him to Timothy McVeigh, the big difference would be that the Zodiac Killer actually had multiple dates of activity, and Timothy McVeigh is primarily associated with one bombing, the Oklahoma City bombing, and the Zodiac also didn't follow through with his bomb threats. To the best of our knowledge, as I said, some people think the Zodiac went on to be the Unabomber, but as far as Timothy McVeigh goes, I can see how the Zodiac is creating the image of fear into the public. He's using his crimes as a way to terrorize the public. In the absolute first video that I ever saw about the Zodiac Killer, it was on the TV show America's Most Wanted. John Walsh was saying he terrorized the San Francisco Bay Area. And I was like, okay, well, I got to know more about this particular suspect. And believe it or not, that was only 30 years after the Zodiac crimes. It took place in the 1960s, and it seems like 2 lifetimes have now passed since the Zodiac murders. But are people looking for him in the wrong places? Yes, to a certain extent, because the domestic terrorist angle has been downplayed. When we talk about the Weather Underground, as I did in a recent episode, both with Jeremy Berthium, one of the guests on the show, and in my own follow-up response, the Weather Underground detonated bombs, and to the best of our knowledge, they didn't kill anyone. It's possible, but I'm going to clarify, they have not been convicted for any murders. Or, yeah, I think that's the fairest way to put it, that they have not been convicted for this, although it's quite likely that they did kill people. When I said they didn't kill anyone, accusations and destruction, but they were not charged with murder such as the murder of Brian V. McDonnell, which has a Zodiac connection in itself. Instead, they are viewed as domestic terrorists. I think they were domestic terrorists. Some people think that they are heroes, and I am not one of them. But based on their actions, they terrorized the public. The Zodiac terrorized the public. Yeah, he should be viewed as a domestic terrorist. Now, does this mean that we should be looking for a different type of criminal altogether? Not necessarily, because let's look at the Unabomber one more time. That's a lonely guy in a cabin who, much like James Holmes, couldn't find love. He couldn't find the appreciation from women that he wanted, and also he couldn't find people to value his intellect in a particular way. And by that I mean the Unabomber went through some experiments at Harvard University from Dr. Henry Murray, where they wanted to see how people would respond to interrogation tactics, and he was more or less dealing with people from the legal studies departments who would try to challenge his worldview and more or less destroy his worldview. And it just seems like a very humiliating and degrading experience. And that's what I meant when I said about not appreciating his way of thinking, because I think somebody like Ted Kaczynski, or perhaps even James Holmes, or perhaps even the Zodiac Killer, would use thinking as a form of refuge, like getting lost in their imagination. I think whoever the Zodiac was, I think he got lost in his imagination a lot, inside his own head, reframing situations where he comes out on top, reframing conversations where he didn't do anything wrong. But that's my personal take on the subject, and we'll see what happens once the case is solved, and I hope indeed that the Zodiac killer case is solved. But anyway, I would like to thank Michael Fisher for that challenge question, and I want to know your response. Should the Zodiac be viewed more as a domestic terrorist or viewed more as a serial killer? And my ultimate response was he should be both 50-50, but let me know what you think, and you can send anything to BlackBoxOnlineRadio@AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is in the description box. BlackBoxNet88 on Instagram. Feel free to look at some of the short content that is going to be coming out. And please stay tuned for part 2 of this week's Zodiac Killer News Report on the Anything Goes Friday segment. That's all for me now. Goodbye.